human lives turned into profit. Men, women, and children were reduced to balance sheets. Their pain was priced. Their futures were traded. This is not just a story of slavery. It is the story of how entire economic systems, including governments and modern banks, were built by selling human beings. Slavery in the 18th and 19th centuries was not a hidden crime. It was legal, regulated, and publicly defended. European empires, particularly Britain, Portugal, Spain, France, and the Netherlands, created a global system where human beings were treated as export goods. Ships didn't just carry sugar, cotton, or tobacco. They carried people. Entire national economies depended on this trade. And governments didn't just allow it, they managed, taxed, insured, and financed it. This wasn't chaos. It was organization. A legal industry of human suffering. The system was known as the triangular trade, and it was a perfect machine. Europe exported weapons, alcohol, and manufactured goods to Africa. In Africa, enslaved people were captured through war, kidnapping, or forced tribute, then forced onto ships bound for the Americas. There, they were sold to work on plantations, producing sugar, cotton, tobacco, and coffee goods that were then shipped back to Europe for massive profits. Each leg of the triangle was profitable. And at the center of it all stood banks, insurers, and investors. Human bodies were the engine of this global economy. In many regions of West and Central Africa, local rulers and elites were forced into a brutal choice. The European demand for labor was endless, and their weapons were overwhelming. Some African states began selling their own people prisoners, rivals, even entire villages in exchange for firearms, gold, and political survival. This doesn't excuse the trade, but it exposes the truth. Slavery was not just imposed, it was weaponized economics. Once the system began, escaping it became nearly impossible. It was a cycle of violence fueled by profit. The numbers are staggering, and we have to say them aloud. Between the 1500s and 1800s, over 12 million Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic. Around 2 million died during the Middle Passage alone, the brutal journey across the ocean. Survivors were sold at auction, branded, beaten, and worked to death. Yet to investors back in Europe, these were not tragedies. They were acceptable losses calculated into the cost of doing business. Here's the part history books often soften: how banks turned slavery into finance. This vast, horrific enterprise required capital. Ships were expensive to build and crew. Insurance was necessary to protect against storms or rebellions. Loans were required to buy land and enslaved people before any profits were made. So banks stepped in. Institutions like the predecessors to Barclays, Lloyd's of London, and HSBC financed slave voyages, insured enslaved people as cargo, and issued credit to plantation owners. If enslaved people died, insurance paid out. Human suffering became a financial instrument, a line item on a ledger. This wasn't a side business. It was foundational to the birth of modern capitalism. Britain officially abolished the slave trade in 1807 and slavery in its colonies in 1833, but here's the twist. The British government paid compensation, not to the enslaved people who had lost everything, but to the slave owners for their loss of property. The payout was so massive, £20 million, about 40% of the government's entire budget that year, that British taxpayers only finished paying off the debt in 2015. Former slaves received nothing. Their owners, now flush with cash, became powerful investors, fueling the Industrial Revolution. After abolition, the system didn't end. It just evolved. Millions of Indians, Chinese, and Africans were sent across the empire as indentured laborers. They were promised wages but were often trapped by impossible contracts, punished brutally for resistance, and lived in conditions barely better than slavery. Legally, they were free. Practically, they were enslaved. The plantations kept running. The profits kept flowing. The banks kept financing. Only the language had changed. The machine just found a new fuel source. Much of the wealth that exists today can be traced back to this era: university endowments, banking dynasties, insurance companies, industrial families. The money earned from human suffering was reinvested, compounded, and protected by law for generations. Meanwhile, the descendants of the enslaved were left with systemic poverty, intergenerational trauma, and deep-seated inequality. History didn't disappear. It accumulated, concentrating wealth in some hands and disadvantage in others. Why does this story still matter so much today? This isn't about assigning guilt, it's about seeking truth. Modern inequality did not happen by accident. Global wealth imbalances did not emerge naturally. They were engineered, using human lives as raw material. When we ask why some nations are rich and others are struggling, why some communities prosper while others face constant barriers, the answer lies here, in the records of those ships, in the vaults of those banks, in the ledgers where people were listed as property. When a system can turn human lives into profit, it doesn't disappear, it just changes its name. Thanks for watching, and if you found this important, please subscribe.